wherever you're watching from around the world. We are live from our studios here in Lagos, Nigeria. I am Kelly Egiga. Let's get things started now with the war in Gaza, where we are hearing Hamas leader Marwan Issa has died in an Israeli airstrike. That's according to White House official Jake Sullivan. Israeli media sources say Mr. Issa was killed in a strike on a tunnel complex under the Nuseirat refugee camp in central Gaza last week. As deputy military commander, Mr. Issa would be Hamas's most senior leader to die since the war began on October 7th. The deputy commander of Hamas's military wing, the Izzeddin al-Qassam brigades, was considered one of Israel's most wanted men and was on the European Union's terrorist blacklist. The EU also linked him directly to the October 7th Hamas attack, which led to the killing of 1,200 Israelis. Meanwhile, Hamas has not officially commented on reports of his death. And staying with the war, the U.S. has issued yet another strong warning to Israel against invading the city of Rafah in the Gaza Strip, revealing that such incursion would deepen the humanitarian crisis in the besieged enclave. U.S. President Joe Biden remains committed to the goal of defeating Hamas, as he has sounded the alarm to the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that a major assault on Rafah would be a mistake. On Monday, the Israeli Prime Minister insisted that his forces would act in Rafah despite international opposition to a ground offensive in the area. He has also agreed to send Israeli delegation to Washington, D.C. to discuss alternative approaches to a Rafah ground invasion. In the same vein, Israel's agricultural minister, Avi Deicher, says the ground invasion of Rafah must go ahead if Israel wants to fully defeat Hamas. Qatar foreign minister says the country is cautiously optimistic over talks for a humanitarian pause as talks are taking place in Doha. And Israel is urging top United Nations courts to reject South Africa's latest request for interim orders to prevent starvation in the Gaza Strip as part of a case accusing Israel of breaching the Genocide Convention with its military offensive against Hamas. In a written response published by the International Court of Justice, Israel called South Africa's claim filed earlier this month, quote, wholly unfounded in fact and law, morally repugnant, representing an abuse both of the Genocide Convention and of the court itself, end quote. Meanwhile, UN Food Agency says famine is imminent in northern Gaza, where 70% of the remaining population is experiencing catastrophic hunger, and that a further escalation of the war could push around half of Gaza's total population to the brink of starvation. While Israel denies that its military campaign in Gaza amounts to a breach of the Genocide Convention, it acknowledges that there are tragic and agonizing civilian casualties in the war. In the meantime, a UN-backed report has revealed that more than 70% of Gaza's 2.3 million population is facing catastrophic hunger. According to the report, people in Gaza are now resorting to eating animal fodder, scavenging, or begging. Reacting to the report, UN Chief Antonio Guterres disclosed that Palestinians in Gaza are enduring horrifying levels of hunger and suffering. According to health officials in Gaza, at least 31,819 people have been killed and over 73,934 others injured since the attacks.
The latest report on food insecurity in Gaza is an appalling indictment of conditions on the ground for civilians. The world's leading experts on food insecurity clearly document that famine in the northern part of Gaza is imminent. More than half of all Palestinians in Gaza, 1.1 million people, have completely exhausted their food supplies and are facing catastrophic hunger, according to the report. Palestinians in Gaza are enduring horrifying levels of hunger and suffering. This is the highest number of people facing catastrophic hunger ever recorded by the integrated food security classification system anywhere, anytime. This is an entirely man-made disaster, and the report makes clear that it can be halted. Today's report is Exhibit A for the need for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. I call on the Israeli authorities to ensure complete and unfettered access for humanitarian goods throughout Gaza, and for the international community to fully support our humanitarian efforts. We must act now to prevent the unthinkable, the unacceptable, and the unjustifiable.
UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres speaking there on the dire and catastrophic situation in Gaza. VOA's correspondent Linda Grandstein is live for us in Jerusalem. Linda, great to see you again. It's been a busy 24 hours with developments from the region. We now have details of that all-important conversation between U.S. President Joe Biden and Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. But let's begin our conversation with the update that at least 50 people have been killed and many more detained in Israeli raid on Gaza's Al-Shifa hospital. We spoke about that yesterday in our conversation with you. What more do we know?
Well, it's ongoing, and the Shifa hospital is the largest hospital. Now, Israel says that all 50 of those killed were Hamas terrorists, including a fairly senior Hamas official who was, involved there. And Israel says that Hamas was using the hospital as a base to launch operations against Israel. Hamas says that most of those killed were civilians. It denies using the hospital as a base. And in addition, several thousand people from the area of the hospital have been forced to leave. They've evacuated. Israel had said that nobody should be in northern or central Gaza, but a lot of people have come back just because of, not really having any place to go. So it's been another, groups of people have left. And as you said, at least 50 were killed, if not more, and several hundred were wounded.
Mm. And Qatar plays an essential role in the ongoing negotiations as a mediator. Authorities in that country say they are, quote, cautiously optimistic after the start of indirect talks between Hamas and Israel. What are you hearing regarding this initial stage of negotiations?
Well, while Qatar says they're cautiously optimistic, Israel says the two sides are still very far apart. This is for a phased ceasefire plan. In the first phase, Hamas would free 40 of the 130 hostages that are still being held in Gaza. Now, of that 130, at least 35 are not alive, perhaps more. The 40 hostages who would be freed are women, both soldiers and civilians, wounded people and elderly people. Yesterday, an 86-year-old hostage, it was his birthday, and he's believed to still be alive. And then in exchange for that freedom, Israel would free hundreds of Palestinian prisoners, including some who had murdered Israelis, and there would be a 6-week ceasefire and large amounts of aid going into Gaza. During that time, they would begin negotiating a second stage, which would lead to a more permanent ceasefire and the release of all of the hostages. Both Israel and Hamas have an interest in this first stage. Israel very much wants the hostages out. The hostage families have been increasing pressure on the government, saying that the hostages are running out of time. They've been held for 5.5 months in very difficult conditions. Some of them have health problems. And so the hostage issue is really a very, very important issue for Israel. Hamas, on the other hand, wants to show that it can get a lot of humanitarian aid into Gaza and to try to alleviate the humanitarian situation there.
And Linda, let's talk about that phone call between U.S. President Joe Biden and Israeli Prime Minister Mr. Netanyahu. I mean, the Prime Minister says he made supremely clear to the U.S. President, Mr. Joe Biden, that Israel is determined to complete the elimination of the Hamas battalions in Rafah. President Biden, on the other hand, has insisted that a major assault on Rafah would be a mistake. Why doesn't the Israeli Prime Minister say it as a mistake?
Well, what Israel says is that it started this operation in Gaza with two goals. The first is freedom for the hostages, and the second is to destroy Hamas as a military power. Israeli officials say they didn't start this, that on October 6th, there was no war with Hamas. It began on October 7th when thousands of Hamas gunmen came into Israel, murdered civilians, children, women, took about 250 people captive. Now, what Israel says is that if it stops the war without going into Rafah, that leaves 4 Hamas battalions still in Rafah, and that Hamas would be able to reconstitute itself eventually. And that a few years down the road, Israel will be facing this again. Most Israelis do see this war as a war for existence, and they are willing to continue into Rafah. At the same time, there is growing awareness in Israel, certainly, about the Palestinian civilian difficulties. Israel has said that it would move the civilians in Rafah to safety, but you're talking about up to 1.5 million people, and it's not clear where they would be moved to and how Israel would be able to provide for them during that move. So I think what we saw from that conversation is that the U.S. and Israel have very different ideas about where the war should go from this point.
And so about the killing of Hamas leader Marwan Issa, it's one of the few killings of the Hamas leadership within Gaza. I wonder, can I ask you, has the Israeli government confirmed his death? And what possible impact will that have on Hamas's response to the Israeli invasion?
Well, Israel has been saying for the past week or so that they believe that he was killed, but they didn't have final confirmation. It's actually interesting that this confirmation came from the United States rather than from Israel or Hamas, but it certainly makes it more believable. As you said, he is the number 3 person in Hamas. He is the most senior leader that Israel has assassinated. The Hamas leaders are believed to be hiding deep underneath the ground in this very extensive tunnel network that Israel has been discovering and destroying over the past few months. It's definitely an achievement for Israel. It's not the same achievement as, assassinating Yahya Sinwar, who is the, number 1 in Hamas and the head of it, or his number 2, Mohammed Deif, who are both better known in Israel. Marwan Issa was not all that well known. At the same time, I think it's being seen in Israel as an achievement at a time when Israel hasn't been able to have too many military achievements. The fact that fighting is still going on in central and southern Gaza, which is central and northern Gaza, which Israel said it took over weeks ago, shows that Hamas is able to still function as a guerrilla group, still attack, still kill Israeli soldiers. So I think for Israel, it's an important achievement when they need one. In terms of the Hamas response, I don't think it's going to be any different. I mean, there's an all-out war now between Israel and Hamas, and both sides are doing whatever they can to, hit at the other side.
All right. So, I mean, some international media outlets have been reporting stories around famine and starvation in Gaza. Has the Israeli government confirmed such reports?
Well, Israel says that if it hasn't confirmed it, and Israel says that it is willing to allow as much aid into Gaza as is possible. It gives figures of how many trucks have gone in. It says there should be enough food in Gaza. There was a video that was sent around, and including by people in the Israeli government, of the market in Rafah, with a lot of goods for sale, including the humanitarian goods that were donated by the UN, and it's being sold on the black market. Israel says that either Hamas is stealing the aid, civilians are stealing the aid. They also say that a lot of the trucks are backed up and that Israel has inspected them, is prepared to let them in, and that Hamas does not have a distribution network that either Hamas or the UN is not able to distribute the goods. So, as has been happening, each side is blaming the other. Israel says it's the fault of the UN and the international community. They say that it's the fault of Israel. Israel. So each side is definitely blaming the other, but Israel does say that it believes these reports of famine are very exaggerated.
Well, one thing remains certain. The conditions remain dire. We understand about 13,000 children have been killed in the war. The battles between Hamas fighters and Israeli military continues in the vicinity of the Al-Shifa hospital. Melinda, it's a fine place to anchor conversation as always. VOA is a correspondent live for us in Jerusalem. Linda Grandstein, thank you indeed.
Thank you.